R.S. Thomas was a Welsh poet who lived and died in Wales, was a militant Welsh nationalist and an Anglican priest, and who I think should be considered one of the greatest English language poets of the late 20th century, if not of modern times. Ironically, he didn't learn Welsh until he was 30, at which point he claimed it was too late to start writing in it. He was born in Cardiff in 1913 and died in Gwynedd at the age of 87. He was famously irascible and alienated some of his parishioners. His son recalls his sermons being about the evils of modern technology, refrigerators, televisions, washing machines. He refused to own a vacuum cleaner because he said it was too noisy. In 1978, he and his wife moved to a small, unheated cottage in rural Wales, where the temperature frequently dropped below zero. The reason all this is relevant is because there's a common theme to nearly all of his poems, and that's the difficulty of life once it's properly understood, and the forbidding obscurity of the divine. He was strongly influenced by the thought of Søren Kierkegaard, but also by apophatic theology, the idea that God can only be comprehended indirectly and obliquely, if at all. His poetry took on an even more strongly metaphysical turn in about 1972. If we can get hold of his later poems, 1972 to 1982, and if you're at all concerned with the so-called meaning of life, I can guarantee you'll find it both profound and affecting. In 1996, he was nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature. He didn't win, but one feels that at some point in his long career, he ought to have. Incidentally, even if you've never heard of him, there's a chance you may still know one of his poems. In 1998, the Manic Street Preachers referenced one of his last poems, Reflections, in the liner notes to their fifth album, This Is My Truth, Tell Me Yours. The Furies are at home in the mirror, it begins. It is their address. The best way to give a sense of any poet is by reading some of their poetry. I haven't done that in the past, much to my discredit. I suppose I was worried about copyright. But then this is a review, so it should count as fair citation, and the uselessness of my voice, but I don't think AI would get the emphases, so we've no choice. Anyway, I've chosen two examples at random, both from the later poems. The first is called Remedies, and it's about the increasing impossibility of finding depth of meaning in conventional society. There were people around. I would have spoken with them, but the situation had got beyond language. Machines were invented to cope, but they also were limited by our expectations. Men stared with a sort of growing resentment at life that was ubiquitous and unseizable. A sense of betrayal at finding themselves alive at all maddened the young. The older, following the narrowing perspectives of art, squinted at where a god died. Between fierce alternatives, there was need, as always, of a third way. History was the proliferation of the offerers of such. Fortunes were made on the ability to disappoint. The second is slightly longer, although none of his poems are very long. It's called Somewhere, and it speaks of a dimly intuited place of perfection. Something to bring back to show you've been there. A lock of God's hair stolen from him while he was asleep. A photograph of the Garden of the Spirit. As has been said, the point of travelling is not to arrive, but to return home laden with pollen you shall work up into the honey the mind feeds on. What are our lives but harbours we're continually setting out from, airports at which we touch down and remain in too briefly to recognise what it is they remind us of, and always in one another we seek the proof of experiences it would be worth dying for. Surely there is a shirt of fire this one wore that is hung up now like some rare fleece in the Hall of Heroes. Surely these husbands and wives have dipped their marriages in a fast spring. Surely there exists somewhere, as the justification for our looking for it, the one light that can cast such shadows. In 1955, John Betjeman wrote an introduction to Thomas's first major collection of poetry, Song at the Year's Turning, in which he predicted that Thomas would long outlast him. I am a fan of John Betjeman's poetry. I think he's much better than is often supposed, although he's always been unfashionable. But in this case, I entirely agree with him.